All of that is pre-planned to be animated like that.
That's like next level stuff. You're like, wow, you're making the puppets make mistakes to be more human.
Yeah, there is a thing, Hayao Miyazaki, the animator in Japan, said if you animate the ordinary, it will be extraordinary. And the whole movie does that. We believe, everybody that made this movie believes that animation is not a genre just for kids. Animation is art. Animation is film.
Yeah.
And we're trying to make you see these guys and say, they're actors. Forget that they're puppets.
Yeah, I read one write-up of this because I was so excited to have you on the show. Even before, just looking at a trailer, and they said it's your dark take on Pinocchio. Do you believe that it's a dark take?
I think the opposite. I find it incredibly beautiful and moving. When you see it, you will call your kids or your parents.
Recently, I had watched Guillemero Del Toro's Pinocchio. Apparently it had been out in cinemas for some time, or for a limited screening as far as I'm aware, before being released on Netflix just recently this December of 2022. This has been a film that people have been anticipating for some time. After all, the name Guillemero Del Toro is attached to this film, and if you don't know who Guillemero Del Toro is, he's one of the most influential filmmakers alive today. Guillemero Del Toro is responsible for making what people consider to be filmmaking masterpieces like Pan's Labyrinth. And for people in the video game culture out there, they'll recognize Guillermo del Toro as a collaborator with famous video game auteur Hideo Kojima, even making a direct appearance in his game Death Stranding. Del Toro is probably one of the most creatively thinking directors out there, alongside people like Hayao Miyazaki. People who are familiar with Del Toro's movies will recognize his anti-war themes, his fascination with pre-Christian pagan tales. He's a man who likes to put a lot of theming into his films and a lot of symbolism. And he's not afraid to go into some dark subject matter. So, when you have a name like that attached to Pinocchio, I think you're going to be in for quite an ambitious undertaking for this fairy tale, which was already pretty dark to begin with before Disney adapted it, but still keeping some of the dark elements in it. And something I've noticed recently is that for some weird reason, 2022 was chock full of Pinocchio movies. So, how does Guillermo del Toro's rendition of Pinocchio stand out amongst this year? To be honest, I'm not gonna lie, lest my nose would grow. I love it! I really like it! A great success! I love it! If you haven't seen this specific version of Pinocchio, you either need to somehow travel back in time to see it in the cinema. You either need to travel back in time to see when it was screening in cinemas, or get yourself a Netflix subscription and watch this near masterpiece of a movie. It's worth the wait. Now, the film isn't entirely perfect. A lot of people would say that all these themes that Del Toro has added in the film, while great, some of the themes might not be absolutely necessary. And there's some elements which might seem a bit inconsistent. Like how, for like the first half or more of this movie, it's a musical, but then for the second half, there's not many more songs apart from Jiminy Sebastian Cricket's number at the end credits. And some might complain that some characters that appear in certain scenes don't really add much to anything in later scenes. Like, there was a bit of potential there that wasn't quite fully realized for the rest of the film. I can imagine there'll be some people online who will say that the themes were kind of mixed. But all these flaws aside, this is honestly an animated near masterpiece. What makes this film so incredible is the stop motion animation. I've got a friend of mine who tells me that the animation is flawless. Like, if you might as well see this movie just for the animation alone. It's beautiful. It's brilliantly handcrafted, and my friend described that the backdrops resemble Vincent van Gogh paintings. Aye, laddie! I recommend this too! The character movements are so fluid, and the character designs are pretty unique. They have this balance of whimsy, yet also grittiness to it. It's got its rough edges, but that's fairly thematically appropriate, because the fact that this is a stop-motion adaptation of this specific story, I think is thematical genius on Guillemero Del Toro's part, because what better way to tell a story about a handcrafted puppet than using an animation form that uses, well, hand-crafted puppets. Hand-crafted puppets. I mean, it just makes perfect sense. And with that element, you really look and feel all the effort that's gone into this film. It makes Pinocchio all the more lifelike with his pine wooden textures. The movement is so fluid, with really provoking creative imagery, which also ties into the themes that this movie is trying to convey on Guillermo del Toro's part. There's also some really creative character designs which lend well to the thematics that I think Guillermo del Toro wasn't trying to convey. For example, the blue fairy in this version of Pinocchio resembles a seraphim. If you're unfamiliar with what a seraphim is, in Christian theology, a seraphim is a high-ranking angel with wings to cover their arms and their legs in respect to God, and with many different eyes across their feathers and their wings. There are some people online who have made these videos of biblically accurate angels, so that's what this blue fairy looks like. It looks really cool, I'm not gonna lie. But you see, seraphim have these wings that cover their arms and their legs in respect of decency to God, and they have eyes all over their wings to resemble that they see a lot of things. And it looks really cool. It's really creative. It's as if Del Toro is trying to convey that, in the context of the story at least, God is answering Geppetto's prayers to have a son to love in a way, and that this seraphim fairy allows Pinocchio to live in answer to Geppetto's prayers to God. And it's interesting to see that in this version of the story, we have this opening that's not too far off from Disney Pixar's Up, in which we see Geppetto spending some loving time with his son,
who might look a little bit creepy at first, but you eventually get used to.
I was already hooked and loving this film at those first few minutes. And sadly, Geppetto's son, Carlo, dies due to being bombarded by a bomb, leaving Geppetto to be in such a state of grief that he plants a pine tree and then just cries out to God in anger, "Why don't you bring my son back?" And then, in a drunken rage of grief, cuts down the tree by his son's grave, drags the wood with him to his workshop, and carves the puppet to resemble his son. Part of the wood being Sebastian J. Crickett's home. So the way Pinocchio is designed and acts makes a lot of thematic sense in regards to Geppetto's struggle with death and grief, which plays a big factor in the theming throughout this movie. Not just with the anti-war films, but how the characters respond to this harsh reality of death and these other thematic elements, such as appreciating life because of how brief it is, and how we ought to embrace selflessness rather than selfishness. Now, given the nature of the story, there might be some academic people who might look at this film and say that this film is quite theologically mixed in what it's trying to present, because the story presents both these very Catholic themes, but also these very pre-Christian pagan ideas, which again, very in tuning with Del Toro's taste in making films. It kind of makes kind of a paradox with some of the choices that Del Toro makes. You have this seraphim who also kind of resembles this female fairy. You have this purgatory place that Pinocchio keeps going to every time he dies, so to speak. And there's these bunny people who are like doing the coffin dance on him or something.
outside.
We know.
Mussolini never go well.
And then there's this other female fairy seraphim lioness thing, which again bears resemblance to some biblical imagery. And this film is a musical, and I suppose there are some songs that will really touch people's hearts, like My Son or Ciao Papa, which I heard that Guillemero Del Toro himself had input into writing with the Ciao Papa song. And whoever's voice acting Pinocchio's got a few wins to his pipes. He's a good singer. But the other half of the songs, I wouldn't... And whilst I might make the case that this film is the best stop-motion animated musical we've received since Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas, most of the songs in this adaptation of Pinocchio aren't exactly toe-tapping showstoppers, or at the very least, don't get the chance to be as such or something like that. So I guess in that regard, Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas is the better musical. Come on, admit it, you already have some of the Nightmare Before Christmas songs in your head right now. What's this? What's this? There's white things in the air. What's this? Oh, somewhere deep. Given Geppetto's drunken grief in carving Pinocchio, it would make sense that Pinocchio would come out as a flawed, yet still somewhat innocent boy, because it would make thematic sense that Geppetto, whilst he did love his son, largely carved Pinocchio out of selfishness in a way. Of course, grief is a very hard thing to deal with. But I guess there's this implication that Geppetto had been neglecting some of his duties to the church and to the other people in his community. And having Jiminy Cricket establish a home in a hollow in the tree, which is ultimately where Pinocchio's heart is located, I think is a really genius piece of design, because not only could it state that Pinocchio has yet to fill his heart with real selfless virtues, but it also makes brilliant thematic sense that after a certain event happens, Pinocchio keeps Jiminy Cricket in his heart. So if you know me, I love this kind of visual storytelling. It really elaborates on certain themes that are spoken and not spoken. Also, something else I appreciate about this film, and a reoccurring pattern in a lot of stop-motion animated films for some reason, probably adding to a creepiness element, I guess, is that this film has got some bollocks!
Bollocks!
Forgive me for the rude word. I mean, this still isn't as dark as the original story of Pinocchio, but it's still quite dark. I love it!
Something's wrong with me. I might need to go see a psychiatrist.
As mentioned before, there's a lot of heavy topics such as death and grief and war and anti-war and what it means to live. And whilst, again, as mentioned before, some people might say that this film is a bit theologically mixed in what kind of worldview it's trying to portray, this topic on worldviews and how you perceive life is put into play as Geppetto has the responsibility of creating this crucifix for his local Catholic church. And again, whilst I've mentioned before that this film might be a bit theologically mixed according to the eyes of academics or according to academically minded people, but I think it's still fascinating that Del Toro even attempts to convey themes of belief systems into his film. Many people could even try to make parallels between the figure of Jesus Christ and Pinocchio. And whilst Guillermo del Toro is quite mixed with the theological themings he's trying to convey, I do appreciate that he tries to even attempt this sort of thing. I do really like visual storytelling and theological implications when it comes to analyzing films. So in this film, people might find a parallel between the figure of Jesus Christ and Pinocchio himself, or even Jesus Christ and Carlos, with the idea of this innocent life being taken from this world, even though Carlos didn't do anything wrong, arguably. And, for example, there could be this parallel between the boy Carlos and Jesus Christ in the way that Carlos's life was taken, even though Carlos arguably didn't do anything wrong. And there could also be this parallel between Pinocchio and Jesus Christ in the fact that Pinocchio does embrace these selfless virtues. And again, this film has some bollocks!
Bollocks!
I'm sorry. As there's some pretty grim stuff that happens in the story. There's this one scene where we see a character fall to his death, and we literally see him smash on the rock. Like, we don't see any blood and guts or anything, but we hear a sound effect like, whoa! They put that in a family film? That has got to be, even though there's no blood and guts involved, one of the most gruesome deaths in a family film I've ever seen. Also, I have to give some respect to Guillermo del Toro for saying in an interview that animation is not just a genre for children, but a medium of art.
Everybody that made this movie believes that animation is not a genre just for kids. Animation is art. Animation is film.
Thank you, Guillermo del Toro. Finally, someone who speaks English. This is exactly what people like me need to hear. Affirmation from some of the best filmmakers in the business stating that animation can be a work of art.
You have animations like these. Or these. Or this. See what I did there? Stop motion. And yet, there are so many studio executives and people at the Academy Award who still say animation is just for children. People just don't appreciate art. So it's just as well that Guillermo del Toro gave credit to the animators alongside all the actors, as if the animators were just as prominent as the actors. That's something a lot of people overlook about animation, is that animators are just as much on-screen performers in a way as much as the actors are, in a way. Because when you're seeing the animation, you're seeing what's on the screen. These animators are conveying their art on the screen. And apparently there's this whole documentary on Netflix on how they made the film. And just from a trailer I saw, I've noticed that they had differently sized stop-motion puppets just to get the detail right. That is insane. So, overall, how do I rank Guillermo del Toro's rendition of Pinocchio as portrayed on Netflix? This movie is not flawless, but I would still call it a stop-motion masterpiece in a way. Oh yeah, now I remember what I was going to talk about. Because honestly, given the amount of heart and passion that Guillermo del Toro and his team put into every frame and every element of their rendition of Pinocchio, it just goes to show that genuine heart and passion poured into creativity for the sake of making art is so much better than studio executive poop with no heart and no soul put into it. Disney might want to take some notes in regards to their live action remakes. It's quite frankly embarrassing how Disney, who has been connoisseurs in a way for passionate creativity for so many years, are now becoming studio executive poop-making machines, whilst there's other filmmakers who are making some genuine art out there. And Guillermo del Toro's film will stand out all the more for taking more chances. Seriously, 2002 live-action remake. Root beer? Root beer? So yeah, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is immensely better than these live-action Pinocchio. So, how do I rate this version of Pinocchio? I think I'm going to give it a 10 out of 12. It's absolutely worth seeing. Something else I didn't mention is that the ending is really heartwarming. It's a bit different. There's some stark differences between the ending of this version of Pinocchio and perhaps some other versions of Pinocchio you're familiar with, namely the Disney version. But to explain the ending would spoil the movie. because it really is genuinely heartwarming. So, if you want to see one of the best films of this year alongside Top Gun Maverick, I'd recommend Guillemero Del Toro's Pinnochio. It's worth your time. Scott Meyer signing out. I was going to say something, but I've forgotten what I was going to say. I hate those moments. So, overall, how do I rate?